This chapter covers the structure of plants, everything for plants other than their reproductive structures. So we already covered the flower in our prior topic. And so in this one, we're going to be looking at the vegetative structures, which are the roots, the stems, and the leaves. And so the emphasis in this one is actually going to be with the flowering plants. We'll talk a little bit about gymnosperms will be brought up for some small comparisons here, but for the most part, we're going to be focusing on flowering plants like the oak tree you see in this picture here. So we are going to look at an overview of the body plan of a plant. And so the first objective is to describe the function of the three types of tissues in a plant. Plants have tissues, animals have their own tissues as well, and which is that level of organization where you have a group of cells that are working together for a common function. The second objective is to explain why meristems are vital after germination. And so we'll define what a meristem is and take a look at that a little closer. And then compare the origin of primary growth and secondary growth. So primary growth, in short, is growth in the length of the plant, where the parts get longer. And secondary growth is growth in width, or the diameter of those plant structures. So when we look at our plants, the vascular plants, which is what angiosperms are. They're flowering plants that are vascular. We're going to have shoots and roots. So the root system is below ground. You see the picture here. So everything down here below ground would be the root. And the roots do anchor the plant, and they help absorb water and minerals from the soil. And then the shoot system is everything above ground, and it consists of the stems, which provide support, your leaves, where the primary function is photosynthesis, and even flowers would be up there as part of reproduction. And there's going to be repeating units of structures in there from one node to the next along the stems. Everywhere there's a node, a leaf would grow out there, and then you're going to have axillary buds between there. So let's take a look at this particular plant here. And before we do here, just quickly, you can have what's called a simple leaf where the blade is complete. So this would be your flattened leaf. This would be the little stalk for the leaf, and then you have the veins there. And the leaf itself actually has some names, but that would be a simple leaf. And then we have compound leaves. In a compound leaf, the blade is going to be broken into small parts. So you're going to have the main central vein there. And then just like in this simple leaf, you're going to have some branching, but the blade is not complete. Instead, the blade is broken into little leaflets. So this would be a compound leaf. This is still the little stalk or the stem of the leaf, which actually has a name we'll cover right now. It's called a petiole, and we'll see that down there. There's your petiole there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in here and look at some of the plant parts there. And the reason why I covered two different kinds of leaf types is because this particular plant has compound leaves. So it's very important not to interpret this as one leaf because the leaf is these little leaflets, and then there's the petiole there, the stalk for it. So let's look underground here. Underground, you'll have primary root, and then you'll have some branchings of that root called lateral roots. You know, at the bottom you'll have the apex. The apex is the tip, or it could be interpreted as the top or the tip of the structures. In this case, this is the root apex. And then everywhere you have the shoots above ground, that the tips of them would be the shoot apexes. So every one of these, there's only one main stem right now, and then you have your leaves, but the stems may begin to branch. And if they branch, then every one of those branches would have leaves on there, but then you'll also have apical apexes on those as well. So everywhere that you have a leaf growing from the stem is going to be called a node. So there would be a node there. Here's a node here as your leaves are going up the stem here. There's only one main stem right now. This is a young plant. The space between the nodes is called the internode. Okay? Now, where the leaf is attached there between the stem and the leaf is going to be a bud. It's called an axillary bud. There's that little green dot right there. And in there, there's going to be growth that can occur. And there, the axillary bud can grow into a branch, which hasn't occurred yet. Or it could even produce a flower. So this bud could be responsible for producing a flower that's there on right at the joint between the leaf and the stem. As far as the leaf goes, the leaf has the stalk to the leaf is called a petiole. And then since this is a compound leaf, this is part of the entire blade, but these are the little leaflets. So you see the term leaflet there. And then the entire thing is your leaf. Now some leaves, the leaves are going to have these paired structures. Some are leaf-like themselves, but they're called stipules. In some cases, stipules form thorns. It depends on the type of plant overall. But you have these repeating units, nodes, internodes, nodes, internodes, and you'll have axillary buds all along there. Some of those buds can produce flowers. And all of that above ground, we were talking about, are the shoots. So plants, the roots, and the shoots. Okay. So when we talk about the body of the plant, it's of course made of cells. It's a multicellular organism. Land plants are. And there are going to be different cell types. It's multicellular. Now, we're going to distinguish between different cell types. They'll differ in their characteristics. One of the things that may differ between different cell types is how big the vacuoles are. Okay, so some may have larger vacuoles than others. Another way we can differentiate between different cell types is whether or not they're alive or not at maturity. Some cells develop and then die and become functional, still continue to have some function in there. For example, the xylem tissue that's been mentioned already was going to be made of dead cells. The cells die, and what's left from the once living cells helps conduct water up the plant. And then we can also look at the thickness of the cell walls, how much cellulose and what's been secreted within the cell walls. So here you have a basic plant there, and the plant cell has all those organelles on the inside, it's a eukaryote. On the very, very inside wall of this plant is the plasma membrane or cell membrane. And the cell wall is built on the outside. Now, the components for building the cell wall originate on the inside, and then the cell wall is constructed there at the surface of the plasma membrane or the cell membrane. If we cut out a little area from this plant cell here and looked at it over here, you'd see some cytoskeletal elements. This is your membrane here, phospholipid bilayer. And then on the outside, you can see the fibers of cellulose as they're being deposited there on the outside. Now, this particular cell would be differentiated, or we can distinguish between these two because this one would only have a primary cell wall. That's the initial cell wall laid out on the cell. Now, some cells are going to become thicker, and they're going to start laying down more cell wall. And you can't put the cell wall on the outside, so the secondary cell wall is built from on the inside. And you can see in this case here, there's been some secondary wall built and then a secondary wall. So overall now, this cell is much different than this one and has a much thicker cell wall. So these are going to be ways that we can tell between some of the cell types. Now, once we get to cell types, then we are going to now progress to the next level of organization in multicellular organisms, and that's the tissue level. Remember, you start out with chemicals, then you get compounds, and you get biomolecules, organelles, cells to tissues to organs, and so on. So now we're at the tissue level, and there's going to be three basic tissue types. There's going to be the dermal, and that's going to be the outer protective layer, and this image will help illustrate that. And then there's going to be ground tissue. It's going to be sort of like the tissue that we're going to see filling in things, but it's not just a filler. It's going to have functions. Some of this ground tissue may be involved in storage. Some ground tissue would be responsible for photosynthesis, and other ground tissue would be involved in secreting or releasing things. And then you have the conducting tissue, the vascular tissue, which conducts fluids up and down the tree. Xylem up with water and minerals, and then the phloem back to all parts of the plant. So this would be a young plant here early on, and there's your apex there. And at your apex, you're going to have cells that divide and differentiate. This is done there at the what's called the meristem. And as they differentiate, they begin to form pre-dermal, pre-ground, and pre-vascular tissue. And eventually they differentiate into those cell types. But you can see they've sectioned through a leaf here. And when you look at cross-section through the leaf, it has all three tissue types. The yellow on the outside is your dermal. It's outer protective. The blues represent vascular tissue, and then the green in this diagram represents the ground tissue. And so we see if you section through a leaf, it has all three. If you section through the stem there, you have all three here types. And then even in the root, you're going to have all three of those tissue types. Okay. Now within a tissue, this vascular tissue, there's going to be more than one cell type within that tissue. For example, just the xylem itself, depending on the kind of plant, going to have at least 2 different cell types associated with it and more, and phloem as well. Now, the tissue systems themselves, vascular tissue, ground tissue, they're going to extend from the roots down underground all the way to the shoots above, continuous but branching. So you're going to have vascular tissue taking water and minerals up, and eventually that water and those minerals are going to even end up branching out into going into the leaves. So these would be systems of tissues. So I mentioned meristem, the apical meristems. These are going to be a meristem itself is going to be a structure that's going to have clumps of small cells, and these cells are meristem cells. Okay? And these meristem cells are not differentiated. In other words, they have not come to have a specific function for the plant itself other than dividing and making more plant cells. Now, when they do divide, one cell will stay as a meristem, and the other one will differentiate, and then go on into differentiating either into a dermal type cell, a ground tissue cell, or a vascular tissue cell. So these meristems are somewhat analogous or similar to animal stem cells. Not the same, but so in order to distinguish between them, we're going to call them meristem cells for plants. So this diagram just kind of shows how that works. You start with a meristem. When it divides, you're going to get 2 cells. One stays there in the area where it divided, and the other one differentiates and starts becoming some other kind of tissue. Maybe this is going to go on to become dermal tissue. And then this the cell, another meristem cell divides and goes on to become differential. It doesn't become differential. I'm reading that differentiated. It differentiates some other tissue, so it would be ground tissue or vascular tissue. And then this one into another cell type of some other, or a different cell type of the same kind of tissues, and they differentiate into different cell types of the same kind of tissue. The point is that the meristem is undifferentiated. These types of cells that occur at the apexes are going to increase the shoot length. So they extend the shoot and the root. So these apical meristems are going to be involved in first degree or primary growth. That's just going to be growth in length. And so this first degree is just another way of saying primary. And then you're going to have lateral meristems. Lateral means to the side, and these lateral meristems are going to be responsible for increasing the diameter of those things. As the plant body gets bigger, it's got to get thicker, and that would be second degree or secondary growth of the plant. So looking more closely at the meristems here, and they did in this picture here is they took the shoot apex here, and then they zoomed in here, and then they color coded on the left so that you can see some of the basic tissues. And here's the key right there in the middle for the different tissue types. Of course, on the outside, the green is going to represent dermal tissues, what that box says there. And then down here on the bottom of this picture, they took from the root apex over here. So these apical meristems are going to be found at the tips. They're going to be clusters of those undifferentiated meristem cells. Again, they're going to be involved in, as they divide, they're going to differentiate and start forming, differentiating other tissues. And as the plant grows in length, the tissues and the structures produced from it are going to be referred to as the primary plant body. So just any growth in length, whatever is made from this meristem is the primary plant body. So the apical meristem is going to be composed of these cells that are delicate, and so they're going to require some protection. So the root apical meristems are going to be protected by special cells called the root cap. So that's a structure to know for lecture and lab. So you can see that down here. Here's your root cap all around here. And there's special cells that make them up. And here's where your meristem cells are, right in this area here where they're dividing. And then as they divide, they start to differentiate into these different tissues. And so you can see the orange would be these are differentiated into vascular tissue. They're in the middle. The yellow colored cells, color-coded cells, are going to be the ground tissue, and then on the outside is dermal. This might be what you're on the right side. Might be what the slide might normally look like when they prepare the structure for the plant, and then put it on a slide for us to buy and observe under a microscope. They do stain them with special stains that get them to look pink and purple and all that stuff. If I had to guess, the left side of the picture is computer-generated color so that we can see the different tissues. And then you can see those different tissues here in the shoot apex up here. But here's where your meristem is, and you don't have a root cap there. You don't need a nice structure there because this part's not trying to push through the soil, but the young leaves that are forming here. And so these are where the nodes are. These are called leaf primordia. Primordium would be singular. So these leaf primordia here, you can see they kind of surround and sort of shelter that apical meristem there. So those are the same images. Now we're going to move and start looking at some of this primary and secondary growth here. So looking at the apical meristem, and so here they're looking at any growth that's going to occur at the tips here of this tree. In any one of these branches, there's going to be apical growth, and that would be considered primary growth and produce primary body. Okay. Then we're going to get into the secondary growth. So then down here we can see at the tips here again, primary growth there. As the cells divide, they're going to start to differentiate, and that's what this one's talking about. It's talking about at the apical meristem is going to give rise to 3 primary meristems. So you have your main meristem, your apical meristem, and then you get these primary sorts of meristems. And these primary meristems, they're the ones that come from the apical meristem. So it's apical meristem then leads to these primary meristems. And you're going to end up getting protoderm. And remember, like in prokaryote means before. So this protoderm is the cells before they become the dermal tissue. Procambium is going to become vascular tissue. And then you're going to have ground meristem, which is going to differentiate into ground tissue. So these are the 3 main ones. And then if we look at the diagram here to the right, we'll see how that plays out to make your primary plant body. And then some plants are going to have meristems that are not what we've mentioned already. They're going to be called intercalary meristems. And these are going to arise, they're going to be found within the internodes between where one leaf is and the next one. And what these do is, as those cells divide, they're going to increase the length of the internodes. Remember, the internode is going to be the space from where some leaves are growing to the next place on the stem. So those are called intercalary meristems. I'm not going to spend much time on that as a structure, but there's an awareness that there's another kind of meristem in some plants. So looking more closely at the diagram here on the right, we're going to focus here on the primary growth here and see how your apical meristem cells are going to give rise to these primary meristems and then eventually mature tissues of your primary plant body. So let's take a look here on the right. And so if we look right up here and we were to cut right through there, where we were looking there, this is your shoot apex, and your meristem would be right up there. As those cells are dividing, they're going to start to differentiate into some of these primary tissues. Now, they only labeled two there. They labeled the procambium, which is colored green. That's going to end up becoming vascular tissue. They labeled the ground meristem, which was listed here as one of those primary meristem tissues. What they didn't label was the cells on the outside. The cells on the outside would be the protoderm. Okay. Now, eventually, those cells are going to continue to divide, and they've differentiated a little, but they haven't differentiated into the mature cells of the mature tissue. As these cells, the tip is going to continue to grow upward, and what's left behind is this. Okay. So right at the tip, we have more growth going this way. And then the cells that are left behind here begin to differentiate into those three primary meristem tissues. And then they continue to divide in this area as the plants continue to grow upwards. And what they left behind eventually goes into more differentiation and development to give you your mature plant body. And in this mature plant body, you're going to have dermal tissue, you're going to have mature xylem and phloem, which is your vascular tissue, and then your ground tissue in the middle. And this would be what your primary stem would look like, your primary plant body, the stem. Similar pattern happens here in the root apex. Your root is going to be growing downward as the apical meristem cells divide, and what's left behind, if we slice through that, is going to be those three primary tissues. Again, down here they don't label the protoderm, but they do label the procambium and the ground meristem there. And then as this tip is continuing to move downward, here eventually these cells are going to divide and eventually form these mature primary plant body that has the mature tissues, the vascular tissue there in the middle with the xylem and the phloem, your ground tissue filling in that area there, which may function in storage, and then on the outside is your dermal tissue. So that's your primary growth from your primary meristem. And then you have your lateral meristems. Okay, so this is the next page. So we were on this prior page here, which we were talking about apical meristems. Now we're going to look at the secondary growth. And when we come to the diagram here, we're now looking at parts of the plant that are not growing in length anymore, but they're growing in thickness. So they took a section here through the trunk of the tree, and we're looking over here and see how that might work. The same is also true for roots. The roots have to get thicker. They were left behind a long time ago as that primary growth is continuing to go downward. So the only thing that can happen here in the root is growth in thickness, right? So that would be your secondary growth of the root there. And it turns out that there's a different type of meristem called lateral meristem, and there are cells there that are capable of dividing and differentiating, though there's some limit. They're not full meristem, and they can just turn into any kind of tissue here. Okay, so what this kind of growth is going to do is going to give rise to what we're going to call the secondary plant body here, and the secondary plant body is going to be made of secondary mature tissues. So this is going to be typical of woody plants, like a tree. And there's two types of lateral meristem. There's going to be the cork cambium. You might have heard of cork before. And the cork cambium produces the outer bark. And then you're going to have vascular cambium, which is going to produce secondary vascular tissue. Now that secondary vascular tissue is going to include xylem, which is more commonly referred to as wood. When you buy wood and lumber products, it's xylem. It's actually vascular tissue that's grown as secondary growth. So let's take a look at the diagrams on the right real quick to end this section. And so now that the primary growth has left parts of the plant way behind, that part of the plant now is going to begin to grow in thickness to help support the weight of the rest of the plant there. And that's going to be accomplished by the vascular cambium. The vascular cambium is located here in green in this diagram. That vascular cambium, that green line, is going to be made of cells that are meristem cells, and as they divide, the ones that move inward are going to add those growth rings that you may have seen or are familiar with. When you cut through a branch, you see these growth rings. Those growth rings are going to be made of xylem. And that new xylem that's being placed down there is going to be secondary xylem. Where's the old xylem, the initial xylem that was produced? That's left on the inside there. There's your primary xylem, which is in dark blue. That was the very first xylem that was produced. In the middle, you'll have some ground tissue in there. Okay. Now, the cells from the vascular cambium that divide and move outward are going to become the phloem, which is the other kind of vascular tissue. So the only kinds really of main kind of tissues that the vascular cambium can produce is just vascular tissue, right? So no dermal tissue is going to be produced from this. Like I said, this meristem for secondary growth has some limitations. Now, on the further out, just outside of where the phloem is, where you see some of that red area out there, you're going to have another meristem there, and that's going to grow the bark. The bark is going to, as the tree grows, the outer protective coating is going to be splitting. So this cork cambium is going to be constantly replacing and filling in those splits that are occurring within there, giving that bark that familiar split-looking appearance. Looks like the bark is splitting on the outside. Every time it splits, you got to fill it with more bark or bark material to help continue to provide protection for the inside of the tree. A similar thing is going to happen here in the secondary growth of the roots. The roots are going to grow, and they're going to grow because of vascular cambium. There's the green line. Cells that divide to move inward become xylem. Those that move outward become phloem. And then you'll have your cork cambium as well that would help produce bark that's below ground as part of that tree there.